On the 20th of February, the world watched on in shock and horror as unknown snipers murdered over 21 people in Kiev. At the time, it was widely assumed that President Yanukovych and his supporters were behind the attacks. But on the 5th of March, a leaked phone conversation between Estonia's Foreign Minister Urmas Paet and EU Foreign Policy Chief Cathy Ashton revealed that the snipers were in fact from the pro-Maidan coalition. Soon after the violent protests began and the toppled democratically elected government went into exile, the pro-Maidan forces took full control of Kiev's city centre in a coup d'etat backed by the EU and NATO. The instigators behind the violence on the ground were some of the most violent, extreme right-wing and openly fascist organisations imaginable. Seeing what was happening, the people of Crimea quickly turned to the polling stations and voted overwhelmingly in favour of breaking away from Ukraine and becoming a part of the Russian Federation. Likewise in the east, places such as Lugansk and Donetsk had quickly turned to defend their autonomous regions against the onslaught of the far-right regime in Kiev, voting too in great numbers and creating their very own People's Republic in the process. Now funded by the EU to the tune of €500 million, the Ukrainian government has been waging a war against its own people, and the situation as we know it is grave. The Kiev government is targeting civilian infrastructure as countless airstrikes bombard the cities in the east. It is now estimated that there are well over 1,000 innocent civilians who have been murdered by the Ukrainian government. The Kiev regime has resorted to oppressive measures to silence any opposition they may face. They have even begun to disband the Communist Party, but more worryingly, banned communist ideology altogether. Any opposition to the junta is quickly suppressed by the use of fascist death squads, who have also begun carrying out pogroms and attacks against anti-fascists, socialists, and typically anybody who shows the slightest bit of resistance to the regime, as we have already seen during the massacre in Odessa. The US and the EU are both facilitating a bloodbath in eastern Ukraine, and the mass media is giving a grossly misleading picture to the world. An immeasurable amount of atrocities have been carried out since the coup d'etat in the name of NATO and the EU. They're using fascists to exert pressure on the East and to force people to conform to the constraints of the IMF, and anybody seen to be standing in the way of the Kiev regime and its newfound relationship with the EU is quickly wiped out. The Kiev regime is hell-bent on causing mayhem, carnage and inducing fear as much as possible. They're attempting to frighten entire regions into submission by use of terror and shock tactics. The people in the east have been threatened with dire consequences for their acts of defiance against the policies of the Kiev regime and the IMF, who now find themselves faced with a remorseless barbarism that continues on unabated. The conflict in Ukraine is very much a social one and class-based, rather than one based on language or ethnicity. It's a conflict against oligarchic politicians and the neoliberal hegemony of the US and the EU at one end, and at the very other the ordinary workers and miners. The problem here we're facing in Ireland is that we're being systematically lied to by the media. The line being spun here by the mouthpiece of the state, RTE, is more about pro-Russian separatists and nothing at all to do with anti-government protesters. This is very misleading and an attempt to hide the real nature of the protests against the regime, which is in fact opposition to a Western-backed coup. Right now as we speak, eastern Ukraine is being sporadically and indiscriminately bombarded, but it is highly unlikely we'll ever hear about it on the mass media or from the political class. This is something we need to challenge, to expose their lies and to get the real truth out there to the people. To this end, we call on all Irish citizens to help end this relentless war by opposing fascism and supporting their resistance by whatever means necessary, and help save the people of eastern Ukraine from their own government and from the imperialist powers of the West.